Hi, I'm Larry Rifkin. Welcome to America Trends, and I hope you'll enjoy the podcast that we're releasing today and one later in the week on the topic of fake news. I was asked to host a panel of journalists to discuss this raging topic in our country. If it's all a mystery to you because the term has been co-opted in so many ways, I hope that this conversation will shed light on it for you. My panelists are Gina, Seay, the former senior editor of the Hartford Courant, Stephen G. Smith, photojournalist and University of Connecticut professor, Mike Stanton, former Providence Journal reporter and also a UCONN professor, and Mike McIntire, a New York Times reporter and NYU professor. The last three panelists have all won Pulitzer Prizes for their journalistic endeavors. We'll provide the first part of the discussion today and the rest in a subsequent episode. We'll leave off with a provocative question hanging in the air. The event was put on by Connecticut Humanities and involved both Capital Community College in Hartford as host site and Middlesex Community College, which taped the event. You won't want to miss this episode of America Trends. Fake news. Is it real? Journalism in the age of social media.
I'm Jennifer Thomason. I teach communication here at Capital Community College. So delighted to have you here for this event this afternoon. We have been exploring the topic of fake news in my journalism class this semester. You'll be hearing a little bit from my students later. And this has been a wonderful partnership between Capital Community College, Middlesex Community College, and the Connecticut Humanities. And it is not isolated to today's event. There have been other forums and some video projects and various other things that we've been doing as part of this partnership surrounding media literacy and specifically this theme of fake news and journalism. So to start us off today, I would like to show a video that represents a collaboration between my students in the communication media program and the students who are also studying media production at Middlesex Community College. And that will lead us into today's event. They went out on the streets of Hartford and also on the campus of Middlesex to interview folks about their views.
Fake news to me,
it's taking any sort of news and bending it to what you want it to mean.
Not telling the facts of the situation.
They only tell part of the story, so the whole thing can be distorted.
Anything that is being told to the public as a rumor.
Lies.
Just popular ideas without any factual credibility behind them.
Widely spread articles.
And without any source checking of where it's from.
Something that's not real that's being portrayed on the TV.
Propaganda.
A story that is that kind of takes the person's opinion and try to sway it and present it as facts.
They usually will take clips of an interview or some forum or something and take the pieces that they want, snip it, and then use it for whatever their rhetoric is or their agenda is.
I understand it as a political agenda.
I think it's led to half of the division that happens in our society, you know?
It does cause a lot of confusion.
I think it's a problem because how do you determine what's fake and what's real now?
Maybe can be a problem, but it depends what kind of news we talk about.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big problem just because it just creates a lot of conflict.
It's real easy to take anything that happens, such as that school shooting that happened last week, and really just warp it into, you know, a perverse means of getting your message across.
Well, these days I hardly read the news or check out anything.
Not a whole lot. And I kind of fault myself for that.
I just see my Google feeds.
It comes down to whatever shows up in my Facebook feed, and whatever I like, I just follow that source and try to look at counterpoints to really get a real idea of what I think.
Generally, I trust local news to deliver adequate news for stuff that happens in the state.
If you want to go for like accurate news, I'd say CBS.
The New York Times. I watch Eyewitness News and see Channel 4 and stuff like that.
For a more grand scale, I would put faith in BBC.
I actually trust news outlets like BBC because if it's another country kind of like looking in on us, you kind of get every perspective.
I have multiple sources. I know a couple of different languages. So if you get news just from, let's say, America, the news may be distorted. But if you can, in this case, I read Chinese. If I get news from the Chinese media, you may get a better understanding.
I don't spend as much time verifying news that is real or fake. And the reason why I don't do that is because I feel like that it is the media outlet that is presenting the news. I feel like it's more their job to present the facts.
No.
If I'm thinking that can't possibly be true based on a cursory read of the article itself, maybe the headline, I'm more inclined to look it up.
Yeah, I do sometimes. I mean, whenever the news is not from a noticeable, trustworthy source, I kind of try to find the authenticity of the news.
I don't really think that the problem of fake news can be solved, at least not completely.
It's more of based on the community as a whole.
I think people just need to take it upon themselves to really source their information they get, regardless of where they get it.
It's going to take time. People are going to have to change their way of thinking.
I think we could be a little more skeptical of the articles we read, and definitely be willing to put in the research to verify it.
It's really on you to get to the bottom of the news and what you believe in now.
Special thanks to the student at Middlesex who edited this. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jason Mancini, who is the Executive Director of Connecticut Humanities.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Connecticut Humanities is very excited to be supporting this work and this conversation this afternoon. In 2018, Connecticut Humanities will be a convener to help facilitate a statewide exploration about why people are so distrustful of the news, how technology is changing our information consumption, and how citizens can better evaluate news sources. Fake news, is it real? Journalism in the age of social media will be moderated by Larry Rifkin. Larry was a chief programming executive for Connecticut Public Television for over a quarter century, overseeing the production of state and national productions, which amassed nearly 50 regional Emmy Awards over that period. During his tenure, he developed the Connecticut Experience series of documentaries in partnership with Connecticut Humanities Council. The series covered a broad sweep of Connecticut history and politics. In 2006, Mr. Rifkin was inducted to the Boston New England Emmy Silver Circle for Lifetime Achievement. He has since gone on to return to his first love, radio, where he's hosted a talk program for 7 years on 1320 WATR in Waterbury, and now hosts and produces the podcast American Trends on emerging developments in our society and politics. Very happy to have him here today and with our panel of discussants. Mr. Rifkin.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And what a great afternoon to talk about a topic like fake news. Let me ask you, because a lot of you are students and you're going to have the first opportunity to ask some questions later on today. How many of you think that you have been ensnared in fake news traps that have been set for all of us? You do? Okay. A number of you. Come on, we probably all have. When you read your morning newspaper today, and maybe that's an anachronism, maybe nobody reads the actual print version, but do you think that that was fake news in any fashion? Because it might not have been totally accurate. It was the first draft of history. It may be proven wrong later on. But do you think that was fake news? I mean, if you do read, even online, a newspaper, I'm just curious. Well, to me, I think that's an important point because that gets to intent. And there are people out there who are intending to get us all ensnared, and they have no intention of giving us the true story or even attempting to bring that to us. And so when we look at this issue of fake news, to me, the curiosity has been how it has been co-opted by every side we can imagine, and it's being called out by anyone who disagrees with whatever it is they read, see, or hear. Therefore, it's gotten kind of immersed in a cloud and haze. And I hope that this afternoon we can help to unlock some of the mysteries of really what is fake news. And before we introduce you to this incredible panel that's been assembled by the Connecticut Humanities, let me say that you can look at fake news in a number of different ways. Either it's a new problem, or it's an age-old one, or it started with the dawn of television, or maybe the birth of CNN having to fill up 24/7 in terms of news. It's either caused by or can be contained by technology. These are hard questions that we're going to have to ask and answer. It can either be checked by new regulation or the reimposition of old regulations, or perhaps more government will lead to solutions that are worse than the problem. It's a threat to our democracy, or it's a natural outgrowth of a marketplace of ideas, unfettered and splintered. It's simply a manifestation of a divided country looking to reinforce their own biases and will self-correct when our politics begin to adhere in the middle where America generally has been. And to some, any solution requires removing financial incentives in propagating this material. Because although we can go down the centuries and we can find a lot of fake news before the printing press, after the printing press, the growth of it in the 21st century has taken on new dimensions. And we'll talk about that. But these are basically, in my mind, made-up stories by people who basically are trying to sell made-up news, because just like tabloids versus broadsheet, in many cases, it's more entertaining. And the latest study that we saw from MIT suggests that the fake news travels so much faster because it's intended to entertain and to really misdirect. And we are all taken in by that. So let's get the panel of journalists here and let's talk about this. And I'll tell you, we've got so many Pulitzer Prize winners in this one room. It is pretty remarkable. Let me start with Mike McIntire. He's an investigative reporter, author, and editor, and as a member of the investigative unit at the New York Times, he shared the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for reporting on covert Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election. Did that really happen? Well, of course it did. Mike McIntire, where are you? There he is. Gina Seay is with us, a senior-level communicator, currently transitioning to a new communications career after having served in various editing roles, including content manager of the Lifestyles and Entertainment Department at the Hartford Courant. Gina? Stephen G. Smith is a Pulitzer Prize-winning multimedia photojournalist and associate professor of visual journalism at the University of Connecticut. For more than 25 years, Stephen's images have graced the pages and the airwaves of the most prominent media organizations, including the New York Times, Time, USA Today, ABC News, National Geographic Channel, ESPN. We could go on, but we've only got about an hour. Mike Stanton is also with us, an associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut and a former investigative reporter at the Providence Journal, where he shared a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Prince of Providence, about Buddy Cianci. So he knows interesting characters and topics when he sees them. Why don't you come up, Mike? Well, thank you all, and I'm just going to start and ask you to answer some questions from me. Then we're going to go to the students of journalism here at the college, and then we'll take questions from the general public. Let me start with you, Stephen. With virtually every institution falling in the estimation of our citizens, including the press, has the profession done enough to sustain and explain its standards in the assault on it from fake news sites, public officials, and partisans?
Well, I think we could always improve in that area. Of course, we're a business of communication, but sometimes we fail to explain ourselves very well. Sorry, is that not loud enough? So yeah, I think that we probably could do a better job, and I think that that's going to be really important as we begin to see transitions away from fake news in the future, that we begin to do better ourselves at communicating what it is that we're up to and why we're doing it, and our ethical standards as well.
Gina, what more can you do, those in the press, to make certain people understand this is a profession with standards?
I think that it's important that we go back to telling people why the press is so important, especially for democracy. If you want a free democracy to continue, you have to have a free-flowing press that can educate and put the facts out there, and so that you can determine what is credible and what isn't, and use that information when you're making your decisions on who to vote for, what policies to support, what people to support. So I think that that's critical, that we start to get that message back out there.
Mike Stanton.
Well, I think the most important thing we as journalists can do is just to do our job and do it to the standards of facts and accuracy and fairness, and acknowledge that we're not robots. We're human beings with feelings and opinions on topics and politics, but we have to set those aside and let the facts fall where they may. And there are stories I've walked away from where the facts just weren't there. And I think that's, we just have to be very clear. We have to watch ourselves ethically. I think that's always been important, but especially today when a misstep can undermine honest reporting.
And Mike McIntire, let me ask you to frame it in the context of your reporting on Russia and their interference in the 2016 election, and the way that this issue of fake news has come up in the course of that conversation about Russian interference.
Well, I think that to get to your earlier point, I think Mike is correct that really the only way for reputable mainstream media, if you will, to kind of demonstrate how they're different from fake news sources is to just basically do their jobs and do it well. One of the things that struck me covering the 2016 presidential campaign was how what started out as real fake news, phony stories produced sometimes by a nation state, in this case Russia, which was really sort of creating weaponized information to be used against us, how that concept got completely turned on its head by mainly President Trump and his supporters, who co-opted the term to now discredit real journalism. And it's really kind of an insidious development, because you see the same tactic now being used by authoritarian regimes around the world, where press freedoms may not be as robust as they are here, used to discredit brave journalists who are doing real work. So I think that has to be called out and pushed back against, whenever possible. Because, as we talk about this more today, I think it's important to keep in mind there are really two types of fake news we're talking about. There's the actual fake, phony news, and then there's what people who don't like real news prefer to call it. They use the same term, and it's important to make that distinction.
Well, given that there is an official within the White House who himself has really co-opted that term, are we talking here about fake news, Steve, or are we talking about propaganda? I mean, distinguish one from the other if you could.
Well, I think definitely, the current political situation is twisting the meaning of real news, and I think, the manipulation of news to create propaganda, I think, is something that's a little frightening, and certainly something we see a bit of going on.
Gina, help us with that too. Propaganda versus fake news, or where do they coincide?
Well, I know that the guy in the White House thinks anything he doesn't agree with is fake news. So when you asked us to gather for this panel, I started just researching it, and I had no idea that it was as prevalent as it is. And it's not just the president is putting out there. There's just the citizen journalists who have they call themselves journalists, who have an agenda, and these things the social media makes it spread faster. The competition to get everything out there before your competitor does, for even the legitimate news organizations, causes the level of gatekeepers is not there to filter through the truth and to make sure people are getting just that type of the correct factual information.
Okay, if everybody can speak more directly into your mics, that would help. Mike Stanton, let me ask you, I think it was Newton Minow who said that technology is destroying the truth. Can we get it back if you have all these bottom-up journalists and yet there's no filter, there's no contextual nature to it, there's no monitoring, there's no editing. They put out what they want, and oftentimes they're being remunerated very handsomely for doing it.
Yeah, the fake news thing, and I think the language, like Mike was saying, is really important because it has been co-opted in a very dangerous way. But actual fake news, it's not fake news, it's lies. It's made-up stories. It's like when the president's advisor called it alternative facts. No, they're lies. So don't use these jargony words that obscure the truth. And I think that throughout history, we've had fake news stories. In colonial times, somebody put out some fake letters that George Washington purportedly had written from Valley Forge, questioning the cause of the American Revolution. So those have always been with us. But what I think today, and whenever technology changes, there's always this watershed moment where it brings us great benefits, like Newton Minow was talking about. Is it a vast wasteland? And it's interesting, when radio first came into prevalence in the 1930s, it was such a powerful tool that you all know the story of the War of the Worlds, the H.G. Wells science fiction novel about an alien invasion. And that was broadcast as a mock news program on the radio. And despite the disclaimers, lots of Americans panicked when they heard that and thought we were truly under invasion. And I think with the rise of social media, that is even more pronounced today. Social media is like a drug, and they're trying to hook us. It's almost like a dopamine rush. You see something really salacious, the more salacious the better, and you're quick to share it. I had an example recently where the Roseanne Barr show came back online, and a lot of people were arguing about that and her politics. And in the midst of that, somebody tweeted a photo of Roseanne Barr dressed up like Adolf Hitler, taking a pan of cookies out of the oven. And my immediate impulse was to retweet that. And then I thought, is that real? Is that a doctored photo? Because you can doctor photos today. And I did a little research, and I found that it was real. She had posed for a photo shoot for a magazine that caters to young Jewish professionals like 12 years ago. And it was talking about what can we laugh about today? Can we make jokes about Hitler? But the point is, if you don't do that research, you're quick to retweet it without thinking. And even if it is accurate, what's the proper context? So it's a brave new world out there.
Mike McIntire, if the virulent strain of fake news that now permeates our culture has two bases for it, technology and political polarization, which of these contributors is more easily addressed? I mean, is there a way to get this genie back in the bottle in any manageable way anytime soon?
I think the short answer is no. I think that, in terms of the technology, as Mike was saying here, I mean, it really is probably the single biggest differentiator from what we saw, over the last couple of 100 years. And one of my favorite examples, in addition to the one you mentioned, was the 1828 presidential campaign, where flyers were printed up and distributed claiming that Andrew Jackson was a cannibal, that he had eaten Native Americans during the War of 1812. Martin Van Buren was accused in a fake news story of wearing women's clothes under his own clothing. So, I mean, this has been with us for a long time. What's different, I think, are two things. One is the technology has made the ability to spread this kind of garbage much more easy, and the scale of it can be much more intense. And I think you also see for the first time, as I mentioned before, the use of this type of technology by nation states like Russia to basically wage political, warfare against us. So, what do you do about it? I think, I'd be reluctant to try to impose any kind of government intervention in this realm, because I think it is a slippery slope. You don't know where it would stop. I think the best thing we could do would be to try to educate people, much in the same way we are today, as to where to get their information from and how to vet this stuff. I mean, if you're getting your news, like one of the guys in the video said, mostly from Facebook, don't. Because you just don't know where that stuff is originating from. During the presidential campaign, my own mother-in-law, who's a Christian conservative, told me one day that she'd gotten an email from a friend who was passing along a linked story, which originated on Facebook, saying that the Pope had endorsed Trump for president, which was complete hogwash, but she believed it, and so did her friends. So, if you're looking for places to get your news from, I don't want to be a shill for the New York Times. I think that, reputable, known sources are where you need to look. And, people who gravitate to social media for their news, and I know there are a lot of them, how you reach them and kind of educate them on this. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that one step we are seeing happen with the social media giants is kind of an effort on their part to try to regulate within their own ecosystem how some of this stuff sluices through, Facebook posts and that sort of thing. And hopefully there could be some traction there.
What kinds of markings do we need to help us? For example, if I'm an MSNBC viewer, if I were to watch Fox, would I even know what universe I was really looking at a particular night, or vice versa, a Fox viewer turning to MSNBC? And even within those universes, in terms of what is opinion, what is a host, what is journalism, what is the news content, Stephen, what can we do to make some of this clearer? Better branding of commentary, opinion versus news? What more can we do?
I think branding and education is important in this area. I think 24-hour news has also been, headed us down a slope that maybe has been a bit slippery, and certainly we've seen some of these organizations really trying to reach particular silos of people, and I think that's I understand why people are going to these sources, but it's really important, if we are going to these sources, that we also look at other options and make sure that we're not just looking at these particular sources.
Gina?
I think it's really critical that people realize that they've got to become more media literate and pause before you tweet. I was shocked when I found out that there's 7,500 news sites people refer to, and we know they're not all legitimate. So you need to be very critical and keep a stable of the established sites in your phone, and then and read beyond the headlines also. Make them prove to you in what they've written that it's true, and if you have any doubt, then, take the extra step and go find another source. That's what reporters do.
Mike Stanton, you're teaching young people, like many who are here today. What are they using as their news sources? We'll ask some of the folks who come up, but what are they telling you? They're getting it all on their telephone?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're getting it on their phone. They're getting from Facebook feeds, from Google. But you can use those to link to responsible reporting operations like the New York Times. And I think you have seen an uptick. I mean, even though public confidence has generally been low in the media for years, I think people are starting to make that distinction as this fake news phenomenon sinks in. And since the 2016 election, we've seen reputable news organizations increase their circulation, hire new staff, and public confidence. And I think the other problem is that with the cost cutting in the changing media landscape, a lot of these, and more time to fill with these 24/7 news channels and the infinite internet, is that people are substituting cheaper, easy opinion shows and for hard news and for facts. And the problem is that studies have shown that young people today, we think, well, they're digital natives. They've got this technology figured it out. My 16-year-old son can, do all sorts of things with the computer. I can't. But they don't understand, and there's less education on civics, media literacy, critical thinking. And there's studies, Stanford found that middle school, high school, and college students have a real big problem distinguishing, a news story from an ad, and fake news from real news. And it used to be that we could agree on our facts and we would have different opinions. Now we can't even agree on the facts, and that's all become kind of a critical mass of trouble.
Mike McIntire the other night, Michelle Wolf made some people stand up and take notice. One of the things that she said was that as much as the media, and she was talking to the White House correspondents, they rue the day that Donald Trump began to have this assault on the press, that this is the golden age of the press in many ways. They're coming back, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and they are reestablishing their legitimacy, and he's good for business. Can you tie that together for us?
Well, you really set me up with that one, didn't you? I mean, I think that since the presidential election and since Trump was elected, there is a recognition that this is such an unusual time we're in for a number of reasons, that there is a place for investigative reporting in a robust way where there necessarily hasn't been always in the past. And I don't mean that as anything directed necessarily just at President Trump, but I mean, there is a need, I think, beyond even just his phenomenon for the kind of work that we do at the Times, that the Washington Post does, to really help people understand what's happening in the nation's capital, what's happening around the country. And, it's important to get back to the point earlier about just where your sources of information should come from. I would implore the young people here today to not make the same mistake that your parents' generation did of kind of falling into this trap of confirmation bias, where you gravitate to sources of information that merely validate your views on things. You may have it in your mind that, you don't like President Trump, or you didn't like President Obama, or you think immigrants are bad, or whatever. The thing to do is not to seek out sources of information that just sort of buttress those views, but try to read widely and look for other sources of information that present a whole range of opinions and news gathering. Now, it's easier said than done, but I think that's really, really important if we're going to try to break this sort of era of tribalism that we've devolved into, where you have a huge partisan divide and you have two tribes that view each other not only as wrong but sometimes as evil. And not only is your political opponent incorrect on the facts, but they're just a bad person. And that seems to be the driving notion in a lot of what you see in political discourse today. And it's reflected and fed by fake news. And, you know, we can point to any number of examples just in the past couple of years, but, you know, so it's all kind of part of the same mix, and it's gotten very toxic. And so I think, to get back to your point, I mean, there is a role, more so now than ever, for robust, independent, investigative reporting to kind of try to cut through all this and help people make sense of it.
Before we get to some students, and if you'd like to line up with your questions, that would be great. One more question. Steve, is there a tell so that people go to a particular news site, and of course you do a lot with images, and images are extremely powerful in all of this. We're talking primarily about the word. Is there a tell when you have arrived at a fake news site? Any warning, anything that you should really be aware of or leery of as you begin to peruse the internet for content and information?
Well, I wish there was some sort of flag, but of course there's not. I think we've got to be investigating and critical thinking as we look at sites. I think it's important that we look at a variety of different media outlets. I think that's really critical, but I think when we do jump from a particular link, that we want to make sure that that link is something that is a good, solid news organization with solid ethics.
Gina, if we could just go down and finish this off. Any way to know that you've arrived at a fake news site?
Well, I was reading somewhere and they were warning people against URLs that don't look kosher. Like may have, the first part of the URL may be, looks right, but then it ends with a .co instead of .com or .org. So that could be, you know, you should be leery of those. But there are lots of them out there, so.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, and they're always morphing to try to fool us, but if you find a site with a lot of things that are flashing and blinking and hinky links, and you know you look for an about us to get some background and you can't find it, and things are obscure, like there's no byline, there's no name of an author that wrote a piece, or those are the kinds of telltale things. Or you even skim the first few paragraphs, and if it's all very kind of opinionated and they're not offering facts or attribution saying so-and-so said that this is true, those are kind of warning signs.
Mike?
Yeah, I think all of those are good tricks to use, and sometimes it's a lot more apparent than you might think. I recall, you know, during the campaign investigating some fake news sites, and there was one called patriotnewsagency.com, which when you first look at it has the, you know, American flag and then eagle flying and all these like stories that were basically anti-Clinton, pro-Trump. And buried in the upper hand corner were links to a couple of social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and VK, which is a Russian social media site. So that was a little bit odd, and that kind of got us looking at that more closely, and sure enough, it turned out that was basically a front for an overseas, you know, operator. So yeah, I think that just doing the simple task of looking at the link that the story comes from. Is it really WashingtonPost.com, or is it WashPost.us? That's one I saw as well. That's not the Washington Post. So it's a simple trick, but it's one step you can use to kind of like inoculate yourself from this nuttiness.
If you could identify yourself with your question, and if you have it pointed to one individual, then indicate that, otherwise just for the entire panel. Thank you.
My name is Deborah McAuliffe Johnson. I'm in journalism in Jennifer's class. All right, so you sort of answered my first question, so I'm going to change it around a little bit. Generational wise, like my mom is in her 70s. She doesn't do social media, and she believes everything she hears. So how do I explain that to my, you know, how do you explain that to your parents? That there's a lot of fake news out there. You can't believe everything.
Like, I mean, it's funny because I think I mentioned how this happened to my mother-in-law. A very similar thing. She was pushing 80 at the time and was passed along this piece of information from a friend by email and had a link to a completely bogus website, had this story about, you know, the Pope. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think the most you can do is try to, as I did in her case, try to explain to her that, you know, look, there are people out there who make stuff up now, and you can't necessarily always believe, you know, where this stuff is coming from. And so, but it's hard with the generation of people who just aren't as used to dealing with the web as we are. They're not, you know, don't have the same facility that younger people do. I think that maybe a good thing, ironically, is that they don't spend a whole lot of time on the web. Maybe aren't exposed to it as much as the rest of us.
They're smarter than us.
Insulated, probably.
Anyone else?
My mother, she's 83, and she's a news hound, and I guess that's how I got into it. But I think because she doesn't have, she's not on a computer and she's not on social media, that protects her a little bit more. So she's always relied on the traditional news services for her information, and locally as well. So she seems to be able to discern the truth from the fake stuff a lot quicker than maybe the rest of us.
There was maybe this isn't always the most practical lesson for younger people, but because of the addictive nature of social media, sometimes digital detox is a good policy. And there was a letter to the editor that was in a Texas newspaper recently. It was written by a high school student. And she wrote, flipping through each page of the paper exposes me to articles on a variety of topics. In contrast, scrolling through digital news triggers an onslaught of algorithms catered to my personal preferences. Follow the trails of you may also like, and soon all the information on the web page aligns with one's individual views. A broad understanding of current affairs is best gained from reading the news in print and will help prevent the echo chamber and confirmation bias that afflict our society.
That was good.
And I thought, well, that's a pretty mature, of course, cynically, I wondered, did somebody write that for her or make that up? But either way, that's a very sage piece of advice to keep in mind.
Okay.
Second question, I've heard a lot of cons about social media. I want to hear some pros.
All right, I'll bite. I admit I am addicted to Twitter, and basically I make sure I follow the legitimate, established news organizations. And I will admit the minute they tweet something, I'm the first one to retweet it. But I think there's, you know, it gets the news out there fast. I think if you're just careful and keep developing your critical thinking skills and keep trusting those established news organizations, I think that makes it good. It's okay.
I like to think that the critical thinking aspect is so important. So make sure that we're not just following every link, but we're really critically thinking about it. There are aspects of social media that I think can be very positive. I don't think it's a great source for political news. I don't think it's a great source for, you know, other types of news that would really be found in professional media organizations. If you want to keep up with your friends, I find it to be enjoyable for that way.
If I could just interject about social media, and I'd love to get some reaction to this, and it may be instructive for some of the young people who like to put their every thought and impression online. Recently, of course, Joy Reid from MSNBC had posted some years back some things about her feelings about gays. And now she says, I genuinely do not believe I wrote those hateful things. And yet when you do hear from IT folks, they say, no, that was her thinking at the time. What should that instruct us as to about how much we're using social media and how much we have to live with our lives as they are expressed on social media? Gina, you want to say something?
Well, you do have to be careful. It's just like when people have been telling you for years, I'm sure, with Facebook. Be really careful about the stuff that you post, those photos, and your political opinions, because one day you are going to be out there looking for a job, and won't be able to, say that you didn't remember doing that, because that won't fly. So just be careful with that.
So at the Hartford Courant, would you look at that? I mean, when you were going to look for a reporter, trace back their life on social media?
I never got to hire where we were doing that. We were still pretty much traditional hiring policies. Lucky for, I guess, some people. But I guess, yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, well, my name is Ethan, and I sit next to Deb in class. I was wondering, so you already talked about, this is for everybody, already talked about, there's this whole host of unestablished, easily discreditable news sources out there that are putting out content, and then we kind of lean on this other host of established news outlets and trust to a certain extent that they're going to report the closest thing to the truth. Something that I've noticed, though, is that people will upload things onto the internet, onto social media, and usually it's a photo or a video that's only so long, and it's something that causes rage, and so that causes it to get shared, and eventually a news outlet will pick it up, and a lot of the times it's the established news outlets that pick it up, and they distribute it as like a news story, usually under the guise of, oh, this is a controversy or something. And so they're kind of fanning the flames of something that isn't a complete story. It's just something to get people upset. Is there any worry, I wonder, that they might become just like that other host of, unestablished, easily discredited news sources, that they might devolve to that?
I think that's a real constant challenge. Towards the end of my days at the Providence Journal, we always worried about, well, when does something in the Twitter sphere cross over into, that seems outrageous, cross over into we need to write about it. And there was a case, I think it was during the election, 2016 election, there was somebody went on Twitter, just a private citizen, and said that there was a postal worker in Ohio who supported Hillary Clinton who was destroying Trump mail ballots. And that got, echoed around Twitter. And then a conservative blogger picked it up, and then it found its way into Rush Limbaugh's orbit, and he started, ranting about it. And at some point, then the mainstream media has to decide, well, do we ignore it, or do we put more oxygen, to fan the flames? So that is a challenge out there. And I think when you do report on it, you have to report on it as a phenomenon and put it in the proper context of where it's coming from. In this case I just gave, obviously somebody traced it back and kind of, did the genesis of how it evolved.
Yeah, I think that you have to be careful if you're at a mainstream news organization, so to speak, to not fall victim to, chasing clicks. At the New York Times, we have pretty, strict guidelines as to when we would post something, pick up something off of social media. It has to be newsworthy by our standards. Of course, there's always some subjectivity there in determining what's newsworthy. Again, during the campaign, there was a complete bogus fake news piece which originated, somewhere about this child sex ring that was supposedly being operated out of a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor involving high-level Democrats. Complete nonsense. It rose to the level, though, where a lot of people on social media were buying into it, believing it, passing it around. It was wending its way into other more slightly legitimate news sites. Eventually, as many of you probably know, a guy who didn't seem to he wasn't playing with a full deck of cards, read this, heard about it, and got a gun and went to the pizza parlor to try to free what he thought were going to be children being held in captivity. So here you've got an example of fake news morphing into something that had real life consequences that could have gotten somebody killed. So that's kind of a obvious example of how you would, if you're in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, you would write about that. But also there's a bit of a cautionary tale. You can't completely ignore this stuff. Even before it gets to that point, you can't pretend like it's not happening because, if a lot of people are passing it around and believing it and sort of breathing air into it. You kind of have to decide at some point, what do we pay attention to this or not? And it's kind of a case-by-case thing.
And in fact, that was retweeted by Michael Flynn's son. Michael Flynn, who was president, I think it had just been fired or was still his national security advisor. And you have the son of the national security advisor who worked on the Trump campaign is retweeting this rumor about child abuse ring at Comet Pizza involving the Clintons.
Yeah. How many of you, when you read something and you know for a fact that it's not true, are willing to put on beneath it fake news or this isn't real? Think about that. I think, occasionally I'm willing to do that when I see a photograph that I know is not legit and even give a link to a source that, calls it into question. And I think that's important. I think that we need to stand up for what's right and what's true. And I think at times that means that we put ourselves out there a little bit. Even sometimes maybe it's a tiny bit unpopular, but that we're willing to do that when we see something that we know is not legit.
So I'm glad that you guys think that people shouldn't believe Facebook gossip. I'm glad that Pizzagate came up. Uses fake news can kill people. So I want to ask about the most momentous fake news story of my lifetime. So Iraq has WMD. They bought yellow cake from Gaddafi. They bought aluminum tubes to make missiles. Chemical weapons program is reconstituted, biological weapons capabilities, nuclear. So what Colin Powell said, don't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud. Iraq is working hand in glove with Al-Qaeda. I saw this on TV. I saw this in the major papers. I saw it in Time Magazine, Newsweek. Nobody questioned it. And it was put out there every day, this fear campaign. So, that's led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And I put this question here at the bottom of this. Will anyone mention this?